or growth of industrial revolution. She focuses instead on themes of social class, middle class manners, gender issues, courtship and marriage, all of which come together in this novel. This novel, that is Pride and Prejudice, contains elements of social realism, and it focuses on the merging of the bourgeois and the aristocracy during the era of the Napoleonic Wars and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Jane Austen completed the first draft of this novel, but she never published it. It was titled First Impressions when she first wrote it in 1797. But it was only in 1813, that is exactly after 16 years of her first draft, that she had rewritten it and published it under the name of Pride and Prejudice. This is what is the novel that we are going to read about today. We shall therefore have a look at the novel as a genre before moving on to the details of today's novel. How is novel different from the other forms of literature? We have many forms of literature like poetry, prose, short story or drama. So let's see how a novel is different from the other genres of literature. A novel basically is distinct from all these genres which we discussed just now, that is poetry, prose or anything else like drama. The main interest is in human psychology. It touches the innermost recesses of mind and heart, both. The definition of a novel includes many facets. It could be an imaginative recreation of a reality. It could be a history. It could be a harmless amusement. It could be a romance, a tale of spiritual journey, or anything that you want to mock at. It could be a culmination of all these together as well. Despite the inconsistencies that exist within these varying viewpoints on the genre of novel, several key features can be picked up as components of the novel which was written in the early 18th and early 19th centuries. To begin with, the novel writers would usually show the life of the present day versus life as it was in the past. Characters and events were made believable. You can feel one with them, and if to mirror the people and events in the everyday world, lending the novel credibility and shaping the reader's sense of themselves and the world they lived in. Secondly, characters within a novel are presented in a manner similar in social rank to the contemporary readers of the novels. That makes the readers empathize with them, relate with the characters, because they can see the people around them in the novel, or they can see the characters in the novel as people around them. So the readers were able to identify. Thirdly, the novelists in general paid attention to self-consciousness and the process of thought. This is a very important aspect of novel because there are numerous characters and each character has got its own importance. And lastly, a great novel often seems to describe an entire society. Because of the number of characters, it depicts a picture of the society as a whole by creating a vivid image of relationships among diverse classes of people. Jane Austen, as we just discussed, started writing towards the early 19th century, just at the beginning of the 19th century, and this period was called the Regency. During this period, English literature underwent a dramatic transition with the rise of the novel writing with the works of Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson. Novels in this era focused on broad social issues of morality and domestic manners. So definitely she had an influence of the era on her writings as well. Jane Austen can be considered as a pioneering figure in the development of novel writing. Her novels exist in a small, self-contained universe. There are almost no references in her work to the events of the larger world. It's a small world, a small place where she limits to a few characters and their relationships internally. Basically, the Enlightenment, the age of reason, the philosophical ideas that brought democracy and the rights of man, the rise of science and secularism, and the riding wave of horror that was the French Revolution, a threat of Napoleon's invasion, American War of Independence, are all at the backdrop of Austen's work. We can have a shade of all these being seen in her works. How much of this does she write about in Pride and Prejudice? Let us have a look at this and how the influence of the political background was seen on her novel. Only about all those gathering soldiers who were about to ship out to fight. Similarly, she speaks nothing about the Industrial Revolution or modern capitalism. Pride and Prejudice, the present novel, is set among the rural landowners. None of the major characters work for a living. Instead, they live on their income from rents and inheritances. They are rich enough to lead a life without having to bother about their livelihood. So there are other things and other issues that would be of interest to them rather than their livelihood. Miss Bingley, one of the major characters, and her sister look down on the Bennets because they are not as wealthy. Class distinctions in Jane Austen's works were very rigid during her time, so they were seen clearly in her works as well. The land-owning aristocracy belonged to the highest rung of the social ladder, and all power was in their hands. Next in rank came the gentry. The new prosperous industrialists and traders were rising as a class. The lowest in English society were the workers and the labourers, as everywhere. Though Austen satirizes snobs, she also pokes fun at the poor breeding and misbehavior of those lower on the social scale. Austen was a realist, and the England she depicts is one in which social mobility is limited and class consciousness is very strongly seen. Young men could rise in social hierarchy through career in the military, church, or law. For the women of the time, the only means of self-improvement was a successful marriage. All that they need to do was find an eligible bachelor who is wealthy enough so that they can lead a successful married life and thereby acquisition of wealth. That is why there is so much of importance given to matrimony as a goal and topic of conversation in Austen's writing, which is seen very vividly in the present novel Pride and Prejudice. Since we have seen a brief introduction of Jane Austen, the novel as a genre, and the political movements of the era that had influence on Austen's writing, let's move on to the significance of the title. The title, as we have mentioned quite a number of times, Pride and Prejudice. It is very likely taken from a passage in Fanny Burney's popular 1782 novel Cecilia, which Jane Austen is known to have admired. She liked it so much that the novel portrays life in the general rural society of the day and tells of the initial misunderstandings and lateral mutual enlightenment between Elizabeth and Darcy, these two being the major characters of the novel. Elizabeth Bennet was the major character through which we get to know the story of the novel, and the title refers to the ways in which these two central characters in the story first view each other. Pride plays a very important part here because it is a constant source of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. Social standing and proper etiquette were important in English society at that time, especially among the upper classes where fortunes were inherited and time was spent socializing rather than working for a living. So it becomes very important to concentrate on the manners and the behavior they maintained in a social gathering. Mrs. Bennet's desire to marry off her daughters to men of a good social standing, preferably men a little wealthier than the Bennet family, to assure their comfort and stability, highlights the pride that was taken in a good match for a couple at that time. Mr. Darcy is one of the proudest characters in the novel. His wealth and his manners are impeccable, but there's something about him that makes all the people regard him as haughty. He creates this reputation for himself when he considers himself too good to dance with any of the local girls. Elizabeth is proud of her own rational thinking. She feels that she is very good at judging people and she takes pride in that. She believes that the conclusions she draws are always right and she is never wrong at estimating people. The novel explores how pride and prejudice stand in the way of Darcy and Elizabeth's togetherness. Pride narrows the vision of a person and causes one to underestimate others. Prejudice blinds the vision and leads to false perceptions about others. Only when Darcy becomes more humble and Elizabeth becomes more accepting do they relate to one another and find happiness together. So it is all about the pride and prejudice which at the beginning tries to stand as a hindrance between Elizabeth and Darcy, and which, when reduced, both pride and prejudice, that Elizabeth and Darcy come together and there is a final union of both these important characters of the novel. Now let us move on to the chapters of the novel. We get to introduce to the characters as we move on from chapter 1. To begin with, Mr. Bingley rented the manor known as Netherfield Park. This becomes a great stir in Longbourn, especially in the Bennet family. The Bennet family is of importance because that is the main character of the novel. The Bennets have 5 unmarried daughters. The mother, Mrs. Bennet, sees Bingley's arrival as an opportunity for one of the girls to obtain a wealthy spouse, and therefore insists that her husband call upon the new arrival to their house as a guest. Mr. Bennet eventually meets with Mr. Bingley, and a few days later, Mr. Bingley returns the visit. Though he does not meet Mr. Bennet's daughters, soon Bingley is called upon away to London. He returns to Netherfield Park accompanied by his 2 sisters, his brother-in-law and a friend named Darcy. Mr. Bingley and his guests go to a ball in the nearby town of Meryton. The Bennet sisters attend the ball with their mother. The eldest daughter, Jane, dances twice with Mr. Bingley. Within Elizabeth's hearing, Bingley exclaims to Darcy that Jane is the most beautiful creature he has ever beheld. And at the same time, Bingley also suggests that Darcy should dance with Elizabeth. But Darcy refuses, saying she is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. These are the words, the beginning of the relationship between Darcy and Elizabeth. Elizabeth, since she overhears Darcy say this, she develops a hatred towards Darcy, the very first impression that she had created on Darcy. A remark which everyone were surprised. They were taken aback that Darcy could make a remark at a girl like this. However, Mr. Darcy finds himself increasingly attached to Elizabeth's charm and intelligence in the due course of time. The reader learns that Mr. Bennet's property is entailed. This is an important aspect because the property that Mr. Bennet is enjoying will pass on to a man after Mr. Bennet's death and cannot be inherited by any of his daughters. A note arrives inviting Jane to Netherfield Park for a day. Mrs. Bennet, who is always interested in getting one of her daughters married to a wealthy man, she conspires to send Jane by horse rather than coach. The reason behind this is, since she knows that it would rain and if it rains, Jane will consequently have to spend the night at Mr. Bingley's house. Unfortunately, Jane is soaked, falls ill, and is forced to remain at Netherfield as an invalid. Elizabeth goes to visit her. She arrives with soaked and dirty stockings and is certain that the Bingleys hold her in contempt for her soiled clothes. The next day, Mrs. Bennet arrives with Lydia and Catherine to visit Jane. During her stay, Mrs. Bennet makes a general fool of herself. From the way she talks, she presents herself not as an intelligent woman, but as a fool of herself. We have got an understanding of what Mrs. Bennet's character is and how she is desperate about getting all her 5 daughters married to wealthy bachelors. The morning after his daughters return from Netherfield, Mr. Bennet informs his wife of an imminent visit from a Mr. William Collins, a distant cousin who will inherit Mr. Bennet's property after them. When he arrives, it becomes apparent that Mr. Collins is a pompous fool who is in search of a wife. And obviously, when Mrs. Bennet hints that Jane may soon be engaged, he fixes his attention on the next daughter, that is Elizabeth. Shortly after his arrival, he makes a proposal of marriage to Elizabeth. She turns him down because she is not interested, wounding his pride. Meanwhile, the Bennet girls have become friendly with militia officers stationed in a nearby town. The day after Collins' arrival, the girls get introduced to Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham is also another important character in the novel, who has just joined the militia, and the young women find Wickham very charming. While they converse, Darcy and Bingley happen by, and Elizabeth notices that Wickham and Darcy are extremely cold to each other. She can understand that Darcy does not share a very good relationship with Mr. Wickham. At the Phillips dinner party, Wickham and Elizabeth spend time together, and she hears his story. Surprisingly, though Elizabeth considers that she is very good at judging people, she falls into the story of Wickham. She starts believing him. She trusts his story and doesn't even suspect him for a while. She believes in him totally, and she spends time with him for a long time. And he had planned on entering the ministry rather than the army. But he was unable to do so because he lacked money. Darcy's father, Wickham says, had intended to provide for him, but Darcy used a loophole in the will to keep the money away from him. Elizabeth, who instinctively likes and trusts Wickham, accepts his story immediately. Suddenly, news arrives that Mr. Collins has proposed to Charlotte Lucas and that she has accepted it. Elizabeth is shocked, despite Charlotte's insistence that the match is the best for which she could hope. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennet's hopes of seeing her daughters wed fade rapidly as Mr. Bingley abruptly leaves the neighbourhood, terminating his courtship of Jane. Mrs. Bennet's brother, Mr. Gardiner, with his wife, comes to stay with the family and invite Jane to accompany them back to London. So this creates a hope. Jane accepts the invitation, excited also that in London she might get an opportunity to see Mr. Bingley. After Jane and the Gardiners depart for London, Mr. Collins returns from a visit to his parish for his wedding. Elizabeth reluctantly promises to visit Charlotte after her marriage. In March, Elizabeth travels to visit Charlotte and her new husband, Mr. Collins. When Elizabeth arrives in Hunsford, Mr. Collins and Charlotte greet her enthusiastically. They are happy to receive her. The Collins now live near Rosings, the home of Mr. Collins' patron, Lady Catherine de Boroughs, who is also Darcy's aunt. So this makes the character important in developing the relationship between Darcy and Elizabeth. Once again, Elizabeth meets Darcy, who is visiting Lady Catherine, she being his aunt. Elizabeth's presence leads Darcy to make a number of visits to the Collinses' home where she is staying. One day, when Elizabeth is alone at the parsonage, Darcy enters and abruptly declares his love for Elizabeth and makes a shocking proposal of marriage. This was not expected of him. His proposal of marriage dwells at length upon her social inferiority, and Elizabeth's initial polite rejection turns into an angry accusation. She tells Darcy that she considers him arrogant and unpleasant, then accuses him for steering Bingley away from Jane and disinheriting Wickham, whatever she had understood and believed from Wickham's story. Darcy, who delivers Elizabeth a letter attempting to break Bingley's romance with Jane, as he did not wish Bingley to involve himself with the social encumbrance of marrying into the Bennet family, with its lack of both wealth and propriety. This is where he tries to bring an awareness among the audience of his true character. The audience and also Elizabeth get to know what Darcy actually is. Now, when he tries to convey all this to Elizabeth, in relation to Wickham, the letter states that Darcy did provide him after his father's death, and that the root of their quarrel lay in an attempt by Wickham to elope with Darcy's sister Georgiana. This was not known to Elizabeth. So all this is revealed through a letter. This letter causes Elizabeth to re-evaluate her feelings for Darcy. She changes her opinion. She was wrong in judging the character. That is where she realizes after reading the letter. She returns home and acts coldly towards Wickham because she has identified his true colors, his true character. Elizabeth tells Jane what she had learnt about Wickham through Darcy's letter. They debate whether to expose him publicly and ultimately deciding against it. They think it's not right on their part to do so. In July, Elizabeth accompanies the Gardiners on a tour of Darcy's manor, Pemberley. Hearing that Darcy is not in the neighbourhood, she agrees to take a tour of the estate. As Elizabeth tours the beautiful estate of Pemberley with the Gardiners, she imagines what it would be like to be a mistress of this estate. That is possible only if she becomes Darcy's wife. Darcy himself suddenly appears. This was something unexpected, and he tries to behave in a cordial manner with her. Making no mention of his proposal, he entertains the Gardiners and invites Elizabeth to meet his sister. The next day, Darcy and Georgiana, that is Darcy's sister, visit Elizabeth at her inn. As Elizabeth slowly starts realizing the true character of Darcy, she receives two letters. One from Jane. The first relates that Lydia has eloped with Wickham. This comes as a shock to her. The second, that there is no word from the couple that they have been married. So it is not known in the family whether they are married or not yet. Elizabeth realizes that if Wickham does not marry Lydia, the reputation of the entire Bennet family would be at stake. She understands the reality of what would happen to their family status. As Elizabeth confides in Darcy, now after the letter, he blames himself for not exposing Wickham. Elizabeth blames herself for the same reason, because it was she who believed in Wickham and she was not correct in judging his character. She decides to return home immediately. When she gets home, Elizabeth learns that her father has gone to London in search of the runaways, that is, his own daughter Lydia. Mr. Gardiner writes to tell him that Wickham and Lydia have been found and that Wickham will marry if the Bennets will guarantee him a small income. So, it is all the money that plays a very important role, be it any marriage, and it is once again proven. When they come to know this, from Mrs. Gardiner's letter, Elizabeth learns that it was Darcy who found Lydia and Wickham, and Darcy who paid Wickham the money that facilitated the marriage. So, this is known only later that it was Darcy who has been instrumental in getting Wickham and Lydia married. Otherwise, Wickham was not willing to marry Lydia without the money that he expected. So, once again, Elizabeth develops a liking towards Darcy because she starts believing in him. Elizabeth realizes that her opinion of Darcy has changed so completely that if he were to propose her again, she would accept it this time, unlike the previous time. News arrives that Bingley is returning to Netherfield Park for a few weeks. During the visit, Bingley and Jane become engaged. A week later, the engagement of Jane and Mr. Bingley, Lady Catherine Devereux visits Elizabeth, saying that she has heard a rumour that Darcy is planning to marry her, and Elizabeth is not ready to take this from Lady Devereux. So, she says that is not true. She denies that, and she says that Darcy has never proposed her and she is not of any interest in getting married to him. So, this is again a tinge of pride or prejudice being brought in. So, we see that everywhere in the novel. Once again, such a notion that Lady Catherine insists is ridiculous given Elizabeth's low station in life. Elizabeth spiritedly refuses, saying she is not engaged to Darcy. But she will not promise anything against her own happiness. Lady Catherine leaves furious and frustrated. That is also because of her social consciousness. A little while later, Lady Catherine's visit, Darcy again comes to stay with Bingley at Netherfield. The two friends visit the Bennets, and Darcy says that his feelings towards her, that is Elizabeth, have not changed since his proposal, and he still holds the same feelings for her. Elizabeth tells him that her own feelings have changed and that she is now willing to marry him. That is because she refused his proposal when he proposed the first time. The next day, Darcy goes to Mr. Bennet to ask him for his consent to the match. Both Jane and Mr. Bennet need Elizabeth to convince them that she does indeed care for Darcy. So, the feelings that Elizabeth had for Darcy at the beginning of the novel have changed drastically and gradually towards the end, and it is with the death of Pride and Prejudice that were standing as an inhibition between both the characters, that is Darcy and Elizabeth. When they died, it is then that they both unite. With that, we conclude the novel. In part 2, we shall discuss the important characters, the style, the theme and various aspects of the novel. Thank you.